Hello?
Hello. Hey, hey, everyone listening. Thanks for joining us. Um, I will kick us off. I'm Nina Pullano. I'm a reporter for Courthouse News based in Brooklyn and a co-host of Sidebar, our podcast. We've got Matt Renda here, another reporter for Courthouse News who has been on the ground in San Jose where Elizabeth Holmes is on trial for fraud. So we're going to ask Matt to fill us in on what the latest is in the trial. But just a reminder, these are federal charges. Holmes is accused of lying about the capabilities of a blood test machine that she touted as being able to perform thousands of different tests. And I guess before we get into it, Matt, can you just fill us in? What's the status of the case right now as of this
Well,
afternoon?
basically, the prosecution, the government is wrapping up its closing argument kind of as we speak. And they're just sort of going through, a detailed sort of item by item and trying to, assert that, Elizabeth Holmes did indeed, like you alluded to, lie about the capability of a portable blood testing analyzer that, is known by various names, but mostly was called the Edison, which was supposed to be able to give patients all sorts of biomedical information, just based on a finger prick, just on a drop of blood. But obviously could not, deliver ultimately the technology that it purported to be able to deliver and that it tried to deliver.
So we last spoke. We've spoken a few times about
Sure.
this, including for the podcast. But the last time we did one of these Twitter Spaces, Holmes was smack in the middle of her testimony.
Yeah.
So if we can kind of zoom in on that, and I know it's almost a month ago at this point, but tell us about her testimony and cross examination. What was sort of the
Yeah,
tone?
listen, it was about a month ago, which like I think gives a little insight into sort of how protracted this trial has been. It's been a slog through a lot
Sure.
of technical details, as you can imagine, when organic biochemistry is at the center of any kind of controversy.
Right.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Holmes took the stand. It was quite dramatic. I think a lot of people expected her to. Others, maybe didn't expect her to. I was up in the air about it. But she was basically kind of not only the star witness for the defense, but almost their only witness. Um, she took the stand and she basically, on direct examination, attorneys walked her through, just the founding of her company and sort of, from her perspective, how she built the company into what it became in 2013. And, basically from 2010 to 2013, there was a lot of optimism and fanfare about Theranos and its ability to kind of, basically remake the whole blood testing industry. Um, but unfortunately, that those didn't pan out. I think Elizabeth Holmes admitted to a lot of mistakes while she was on the stand. She admitted to putting a pharmaceutical logos on documents that were internally produced by Theranos and then were circulated to investors. Um, and so, and that was kind of a big eye opener. But she said that she put those logos on there because Theranos had done what are basically called validation trials. So that those pharmaceutical companies, they basically, they did studies in tandem with Theranos to validate various aspects of the company's technology. And so that was her explanation. And, listen, she had to do a lot of explaining of the various kind of aspects of Theranos, including some of the whistleblower claims from Erica Chung, Tyler Schultz, and some of the other former employees at Theranos. Um, and then, of course, she had to withstand cross examination. And I think that like the most difficult parts for her came when they walked her through the Fortune magazine article. Roger Parloff, who's an independent journalist, a very well regarded journalist, of course, wrote an article about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos in 2013. It was a cover story for Fortune magazine. That's basically the story that catapulted Holmes into fame, into the public eye. The only problem with that story is that it contains a lot of just pretty much naked falsehoods at this point, where Elizabeth
Mm,
Holmes is talking about how the blood analyzers are being used on medevac helicopters in Afghanistan, for instance, which was not true. And,
Oh,
and
wow.
so I think, interestingly enough, that it's the article that kind of catapulted her into fame as is where she scuffled the most, because she basically had to admit, the attorney asks her like, well, is this what you said? And she said yes, and then he would ask her if it's true, and she's like, I now know that to not be true. So she
Mm.
did have to admit to some falsehoods, but whether those amount to the crime of defrauding investors obviously remains to be seen.
So, and I'll just quickly do a plug for those listening. Appreciate you tuning in. And remember to follow us on Twitter at Courthouse News. You can also follow Matt at Matthew C. Renda. That's Renda. So, Matt, I want to talk a little bit about Sunny Balwani. He's sort of the other major figure here. He was a co-defendant, but now he's being tried
Yeah.
separately. How, and back to Holmes's testimony, if we can, how did he sort of come in and what role did he play?
Well, I mean, it's a really important part. And, Elizabeth Holmes gave very emotional testimony about her relationship with Balwani. And it was actually really difficult at times, I think, for everybody, probably for the jury. I know it was tough for the reporters here, because there was a lot of intimate details. Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes were not only business partners, but they were romantic partners. She met him at a conference in China in between her high school year and her freshman year at college. He was about 20 years her senior, maybe 19 years, but you get the idea. And when Elizabeth Holmes created her company in 2003 is when she dropped out of Stanford, and she created Theranos in 2003 with the support of Channing Robinson, who's a well-known professor at Stanford. She actually developed her business plan in an entrepreneurial class at Stanford, which kind of gives you an idea about her business experience. So anyway, I think that her, her skill set was very much, she's a really good communicator. She's good. She's got a lot of charisma, and she knows organic chemistry well. But I don't think that she thought she had enough business experience, to really push the company forward. So she brought in Balwani, who, made himself out to be a successful technology executive. He told her that he'd helped launch Microsoft, that he was instrumental in the founding of that company. And so she brought him in. And I mean, I think that it's clear now that that was a mistake. Mr. Balwani, I think, well, listen, Elizabeth Holmes' attorneys definitely want you to think that that's a mistake. And they definitely want to put some of the most damaging parts of Theranos' failure onto Balwani. They're basically saying that he was in charge of the finances and he was in charge of the lab, right? And so their argument is that to the degree to which investors were misled about the health of Theranos' finances in 2012 and 2013, that's because Mr. Balwani, or Sunny Balwani, misled Elizabeth Holmes about that. And it's the same with the lab. I mean, the Holmes's lawyers are saying that the reason that she made it out to be that the finances were doing really well and the lab was going very successfully is because that's what everybody in Theranos was telling Elizabeth Holmes. And so, that relationship is at the center of the trial. And, it's interesting. It really is fascinating because she talked a little bit about, the intimate details of their relationship. She said that Sunny Balwani sometimes forced her to engage in, sexual activity that she didn't want to. And, it was very emotional testimony. And what's interesting is that we were expecting, and it was on the witness list, that an expert witness was going to testify after Elizabeth Holmes, about the sort of psychological impacts that those types can have on a person like Miss Holmes. But they actually declined to call that expert witness, which was, I want to say it's more than a bit of a surprise. I think it was kind of like a shock to people who follow the trial closely. And so we can get into all kinds of speculation about why they did that. But the fact is that they didn't call that expert testimony, and that in the closing arguments, that we've seen here in the courtroom, Kevin Downey, who's attorney for Elizabeth Holmes, I think he's done a nice job throughout this trial, has really downplayed the Sunny Balwani element of this case for whatever reason.
So it's interesting, as you said, that expert witness didn't end up getting called, and I know you mentioned earlier, Holmes was really the only or the main witness for her own side for the defense. Was there anyone else that they called? I
Yeah, so
mean,
they call.
as far as presenting the case,
Yeah, they
yeah.
did. So they called basically. So in 2016, when Holmes sees the writing on the wall, her company's flailing, things are getting bad. All of the press has now turned negative, right? John Carreyrou does those series of articles for the Wall Street Journal. I think those start to come out in 2015, and he relies on
Mm.
sources like Erica Chung, like Tyler Schultz. I think even Adam Rosendorf cooperates with this story, who was the lab director at Theranos. During this sort of period that we're talking about. But in 2016, she sees the writing on the wall, so she brings in another board of director. I forget the gentleman's name right now, but he was kind of in the biotech world, and he testified. And frankly, I think he did a good job under direct examination, but he got kind of slaughtered under cross examination. And I think Jeff Schenck, who's the lawyer for the government, he's kind of their hatchet guy. He's a really smart guy. He cornered him a little bit in the testimony, induced a few of those R's that you never really want to see, when it's your witness on the stand, if you're Elizabeth Holmes attorneys. And so I think that maybe that had something to do with why they elected just to go with Elizabeth Holmes and not sort of call a parade of witnesses because maybe they were worried about how they would hold up under cross. And then I think another thing is like Holmes's attorneys have clearly, decided that all they have to do is raise the specter of reasonable doubt. And so their job really isn't to make a case about why Elizabeth Holmes is innocent or, maybe some alternative explanations for why this happened, with Theranos. They're really just trying to punch holes in the government's narrative and the government's argument. And, frankly, they've been somewhat successful. But that being said, I think the government had a very successful closing argument yesterday. It was done by Jeff Schenck. I think it was very concise. It was very organized. And I think the lawyers from both sides have acquitted themselves well.
Great. Well, we're obviously going to be following up and continuing to report as the jury deliberates, as we figure out. But is there anything else that you can tell us about kind of big picture with closing arguments? The last thing that the jury is going to hear from attorneys before their charge and deliberations, any kind of points the government tried to bring home or the final word from defense?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that there are going to be extensive deliberations. As we talked about before, this has been a protracted trial. We began, I think, in early September. I want to say September 6th. That might not be the exact date, but you get the idea. Here we are, up against Christmas. And, there's been voluminous amounts of testimony. So I think we are going to get a protracted deliberation process. In terms of the closing arguments, I think, as I said before, I think Schenck did a nice job of kind of giving you the timeline and like really talking about some of the contradictions and, the public attestations that Holmes was making, either through her marketing materials or through the Fortune article, which I cannot overstate how like that was the thing that was most damaging to Elizabeth, was the things that she said in that article, because a lot of the investors and even some of the patients, but mostly the investors who came in there and said, oh, well, I was relying on this and I was relying on this kind of information when I made my investment. I thought that the defense, did a good job of punching holes in their testimony, but basically the investors were claiming, right, that Elizabeth Holmes told them things that she told to Roger Parloff and that made it into a journalistic article on the record. And so it has been damaging. But basically, the defense and Downey, I think today and yesterday, tried to say that Elizabeth Holmes was very optimistic about, like, their explanation for it is that in 2010, she achieved a technological breakthrough kind of on the organic chemistry side, that they like found ways to analyze small samples of blood. And that like when she was telling people that Theranos could do thousands of tests, she didn't mean like right away, right now, on the sort of first generation Edison devices, but she just meant that they could do it on the kind of organic chemistry side, and that they were working on the hardware side and on the software side to kind of fine tune this stuff. And the lawyer said today that these people who made investments were sophisticated investors. They signed off on documents that basically disclosed the fact that they were engaging in a highly speculative investment and a company that did not have, a significant track record of operations and of, financial income. And I think that that's all very true. And I also think too, another successful thing that Downey said is that, basically that a lot of these investors relied on the fact that like once Theranos entered into contracts with Walgreens and Safeway to host those devices in their stores, that investors got attracted to that they weren't really relying so much on what Elizabeth Holmes was saying in a Fortune article or in a Wall Street Journal article, but they were looking at those relationships and that they saw some opportunities to make some money, and they got in for those reasons. And, as in law, like, what people rely on when making their decisions is like a really important part of, of proving intent and guilt and all of these, and all of those aspects. So again, I think Downey did a good job. And he basically told the story of like, hey, this is like a go-getter who's founded a company as a 19-year-old woman. Maybe she had some inexperience. Maybe she made some mistakes. Well, actually, he'll say that she definitely made some mistakes, probably the chief among them, which is bringing on Sunny Balwani. But she made more mistakes, and she probably shouldn't have said this or probably said that. But basically, at the end of the day, she tried to start an innovative technological company that she almost got there, that she had reason to believe that it was going to be successful, but ultimately it just wasn't, and that failure isn't a crime. And I think what the government is saying is, well, listen, she did try hard from 2003, but she basically got to a point in 2010 and again in 2013 where she realized that her business was failing. And then instead of like letting it fail and doing the right thing, right, which the defense is saying that she didn't do that. Instead, she chose to commit crimes, and she chose to defraud investors to basically keep her flailing company afloat. And so that's the heart of the matter, and the jury is going to get to decide it here in the next week or so.
Wow, it does sound like, as you mentioned, it could be lengthy. There's a lot to kind of dig into there.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, but before we let it go, and I think I've done this every time we've spoken. Any prediction? Yeah,
I do know. I know.
Any predictions?
Well, listen,
yeah.
I think I've been on the record as saying I think that that there's a good chance that she walks. I think that her lawyers have done a really good job. I think that Elizabeth Holmes, there's a discrepancy, I think, between the court of public opinion and like actual courts, right? And I think that her lawyers have done a good job of like raising the specter of reasonable doubt, right? And so I think, she's up for 11 counts, right? 2 of which are conspiracy, and then like wire fraud of like defrauding investors and, defrauding patients as well. She's not on a trial for defrauding Safeway or Walgreens, by the way. That's a distinction that's important. But,
right.
I think, will she walk on all 11 counts? I mean, that's what it's kind of tough, right? Is when you get down to the nitty gritty and the nuance, like you might see her get rung up on a count or 2. Do I think she will be found guilty on all 11 counts? I highly doubt that. I really highly doubt it. I think that there's a good chance that she'll be found guilty on maybe 1 or 2 of the counts. But I think if I were to make a prediction, I would guess that there's enough reasonable doubt for the jury to acquit.
All right. Well, I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. It's always fun talking to you.
Yeah.
And don't hold me to it.
Yeah,
if I'm wrong,
Yes, of course. It's nothing's in stone. Nothing's on the record.
Yeah, it won't be the first time I'm wrong. That's for sure.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, follow Courthouse News. Follow Matt Renda. on Twitter, and we will talk to you all
All
next
right.
time.
Thanks so much.